My uncles treated me like a servant, but when my parents' inheritance came through, I made them regret everything they did to me. My story is something that would seem to be taken from a book or a movie, but sadly it's real. I have always felt that my life has been a kind of dark version of Harry Potter. When I was barely 2 years old, my parents died in a car accident. I still don't understand all the details. I just know it was sudden, and from one day to the next I was left without them. They had no siblings or close relatives except my uncles, so I ended up at their house. For a 2-year-old child, it's impossible to understand the magnitude of that loss. I didn't know that my life was going to change so drastically, and even less that the place that was supposed to be a safe haven would become a kind of prison disguised as a home. As long as I can remember, my uncles treated me like a burden. They never saw me as part of the family. That was evident. While their 2 children, my cousins, grew up surrounded by privileges, love, and opportunities, I was relegated to the background, or rather, to the category of unofficial servant. My days consisted of cleaning, cooking, and doing all those chores that nobody wanted to do. I was never allowed to be a child. My aunt always told me phrases like, "You should be grateful to have a roof over your head," or "We saved you from ending up in an orphanage." And every time they gave me leftovers or old clothes that weren't even my cousins, they reminded me that I couldn't expect more. It was as if everything they did for me was an immense sacrifice that I had to pay for the rest of my life. The worst thing is that I grew up believing they were right. For years I thought I really owed them something, that maybe I should try harder to earn my place in the family. But no matter how hard I tried, I was never enough for them. And now, here I am about to turn 18. For years, I thought my life would remain the same, that I would never have a chance to escape. But things have changed drastically. It turns out that my parents left a considerable inheritance. I didn't know anything about it until recently, because according to the will, I couldn't access it until I was of legal age. My uncles, however, knew from the beginning. I can't even imagine how many nights they must have spent dreaming about that money, planning how to use it. And now that my birthday is near, they have completely changed their attitude. Suddenly, the same uncles who called me a burden and belittled me every day are acting as if I were the most important person in the world. My aunt has started making me breakfast, something she never did in all these years. My uncle even asked me how I am, as if he really cared. It's so obvious they want something that I can hardly contain the urge to laugh. But the most blatant thing was when my aunt, with all the seriousness in the world, asked me to consider returning the favor. According to her, I should give them part of the inheritance as compensation for all the years they raised me. Can you believe it? After treating me like garbage, now they want me to give them the money my parents left to secure my future. Honestly, I'm furious, but at the same time, I feel like this is my chance. I can't change what they did to me, but I can make sure they pay for it. So here I am, putting together my plan. I don't know if everything will go as I hope, but one thing is for sure. I'm not going to give up that inheritance. It's the only thing I have left of my parents, and I'm not going to let them take it. Who knows, maybe this is my chance to finally get revenge for everything they put me through. Update 1. It's been a few weeks since I last wrote, and let me tell you, things have escalated in ways I couldn't have imagined. I decided to follow the advice of some of you. I went directly to the lawyer who handled my parents' will. At first, I was nervous about talking to a lawyer with all the formality and complicated language. It's not something I'm used to doing, but I knew it was necessary, and boy, was it worth it. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I was greeted by a very kind older man who patiently explained everything to me. He showed me documents I didn't even know existed, a breakdown of the properties, investments, and money my parents left for me. It turns out that they not only thought about securing my future, but they did it with an impressive level of detail. There is a house on the outskirts of the city, savings accounts, bonds, stocks, and even a small art collection. In total, we are talking about a figure that left me completely in shock. It's enough money to guarantee me a comfortable life and finance any project or dream I want to pursue. The lawyer explained that according to the will, everything was held in trust until I turned 18. My uncles were aware of this from the beginning, since they had to sign papers when they accepted me as their legal responsibility. Of course, they never told me anything. What the lawyer did tell me is that there was an amount allocated exclusively for my maintenance, an annual amount that should have been used to cover my basic needs, such as food, clothing, education, and recreational activities. Now, you and I know that I never saw a penny of that money. For years, I wore old, often patched clothes and ate leftovers from my uncle's dinners. I never had new toys, much less experiences like going on vacation or participating in extracurricular activities. All that money that was intended for me was squandered by my uncles, and the lawyer suspects the same. Here comes the interesting part. A few days ago, while I was at school, my uncles went through my things. Yes, that invasive. They found some of the documents the lawyer gave me, which in my naivete, I had left in my room. From that moment on, their mask completely fell off. The first reaction was the usual anger. My aunt confronted me, accusing me of being dishonest for not telling her about the money. According to her, a family doesn't keep secrets. I laughed in her face because seriously, they hid this from me my whole life, and now they have the nerve to play the honesty card. Then came my uncle with his typical authoritarian tone, saying that all the money my parents left was thanks to the family, and therefore it belonged to them. He said something I can't forget. If it weren't for us, that money wouldn't even exist because you would have starved to death. Instead of getting into a fight, I decided to take another approach. I told them that I understood their concern, but that everything would be decided when I turned 18. It was like giving them a little hope, enough for them to calm down. I don't know if I'm a good actor or if they're just so desperate that they'll believe anything. But for the moment, they don't suspect I have very different plans. Since they found out about the magnitude of the inheritance, their behavior has taken an even more extreme turn. My aunt prepares elaborate dinners for me, whereas before they barely gave me a plate with leftovers. My uncle has started asking about my grades in school, something he never cared about. My cousins, who always saw me as the errand boy, now try to talk to me as if we were best friends. It's so fake that I can hardly keep from laughing in their faces. The most blatant thing was a conversation I overheard last night. They were in the kitchen, thinking I was in my room, and talking about how they should convince me. My aunt suggested they should appeal to my sense of family, while my uncle said that if that didn't work, they could make me feel guilty about everything they spent on me. My older cousin even said he could help by making me feel like I never really fit in, as if that were a surprise. What they don't know is that I've been writing everything down. Every comment, every attempt at manipulation. My lawyer told me that documenting everything could be useful later, especially if they try something more aggressive, like forcing me to sign something. For now, I'm playing along, letting them think they're in control. But in my mind, I'm counting down the days until my birthday. When I turn 18, everything will be under my control, and they will have no idea what's coming. This time I will not be their victim. Update 2. I feel like every day I discover something else that leaves me in shock. It's not just that my uncles tried to manipulate me with the inheritance. Now I understand that from the beginning they saw me as a means to their own benefit. It's like all the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fit together, and the image that is forming couldn't be more disturbing. It all started a few days ago when I decided to search through the old boxes that my uncles have stored in the attic. My initial intention was to find some photo or memory of my parents, something that would connect me to them. They always told me that there was nothing of mine saved, but for some reason, I felt I had to check it out for myself. What I found not only confirmed my suspicions, but also opened my eyes to a truth I never wanted to admit. My uncles have been robbing me since the day they took me into their home. Among the boxes were documents that should never have been there. The first one that caught my attention was a statement for a monthly fund that my parents left for my support. As I mentioned before, the lawyer had already told me about that money, but seeing the numbers on paper was different. For years, my uncles received significant payments that were meant to cover my needs. I'm talking about an amount enough to give me a comfortable life, to make sure I had new clothes, decent food, and even to pay for extracurricular activities or school trips. And what did they do with that money? Absolutely nothing for me. All I received were leftovers, old clothes, and an uncomfortable mattress in a corner of the storage room, while they renovated the kitchen, bought new furniture, and took my cousins on vacations to places like Disney and Cancun. I also found receipts and invoices that confirmed things I already suspected. For example, while I wore broken shoes to school, They spent hundreds of dollars on brand-name ones for my cousins. I also discovered that when I turned 10, my paternal grandparents sent a check as a birthday present. I never saw it. Instead, my aunt cashed it and used the money to buy a new TV. The most heartbreaking of all were the letters. In another box, I found a pile of yellowed envelopes, all addressed to me. They were from my paternal grandparents who live in another country. Each letter was full of affection, saying how much they wanted to meet me and how they were willing to visit me. But my uncles never told me about them. What's more, I grew up believing that my grandparents didn't want anything to do with me because that's what they told me. The worst part is that they didn't just ignore the letters. In one of the replies they found the nerve to keep, my aunt literally told them that it wasn't necessary to visit me because I was fine and didn't need the stress of seeing strangers. Strangers. That's how they described my grandparents, the only people who really cared about me besides my parents. After reading all those letters and reviewing the documents, I sat on the attic floor in silence. I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and something like helplessness. But I didn't let myself sink. I knew all of this could be used in my favor. I immediately took pictures of everything. My lawyer is already aware of what I found, and he assured me that this further strengthens my case. Not only is it clear that they misappropriated the money intended for me, but they also intentionally isolated me from any kind of emotional support. Since I made these discoveries, I have begun to notice how my uncles are acting more erratically. I think they're starting to realize that things aren't going as they expected. My aunt now cries constantly, saying that she doesn't want to lose the family, while my uncle is more aggressive, making passive-aggressive comments like, "At least you could give us some credit for everything we did for you." My cousins, for their part, continue with their fake attempt to be friendly, but it's increasingly obvious that they do it on their parents' orders. For now, I'm being careful. Everything I find, I document. Everything they say, I write down. Every attempt at manipulation is recorded. I feel like I'm building an arsenal, and I'm waiting for the perfect moment to use it. My birthday is getting closer and closer, and although they don't know it, each day that passes is one less day they have to keep up their charade. It would have been different if they had been different, but at the same time, that's what drives me forward. I can't change the past, but I can make sure they pay for every single thing they did to me. Update 3. It's been several weeks since my last update, and things are finally reaching a critical point. During this time, I have dedicated myself to planning each move carefully because I knew I couldn't make mistakes. After all, my uncles have shown they are willing to manipulate, lie, and control everything they can to keep what doesn't belong to them. But now I have something they didn't expect: evidence and knowledge. First, I'll let them continue with their theatrics. My aunt continued to cook me meals I had never seen in this house, and my uncle tried to include me in family conversations as if I were suddenly part of the clan. It was almost funny to see them try so hard, knowing what I had up my sleeve. However, I let them believe that their tactics were working. I even went so far as to thank them aloud for everything they had done for me, just to see the satisfaction on their faces. I knew that the more confident they felt, the more vulnerable their position would be. One night after dinner, my aunt took me aside to have a serious talk. She looked at me with her falsely concerned eyes and told me that she and my uncle had been thinking a lot about my future. According to her, they were the only ones who knew what I really needed in life, and therefore it would be best for everyone if they were given most of the inheritance. "We're not asking for everything," she said in a tone that almost sounded sincere. "Just enough to cover the years of sacrifices we made for you. You're young. You don't need that much money right now. We can manage it better and make sure you don't waste it." That's when I knew it was time. I couldn't wait any longer. I took out my phone, which I had hidden in my pocket, and showed her the recording of our conversation. Her face went from confidence to complete disbelief in a matter of seconds. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's proof of what you've been doing," I replied with all the calm I could muster. "And it's not the only thing I have." I decided to give them an ultimatum that same night. I showed them the photos of the documents I found in the attic, the receipts, the letters from my grandparents, and the evidence of how they had spent the money intended for me. I explained that I had already shared everything with my lawyer, and that if they continued trying to manipulate me, I would be more than willing to take this to the authorities. The panic on their faces was almost satisfying. My uncle, who had always been the most authoritarian and self-assured, began to sweat and stammer excuses. My aunt, on the other hand, burst into tears, repeating over and over again that she did it for the family. Their attempts to justify themselves were pathetic, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. That night didn't end there. Before going up to my room, I made it clear that they could no longer control the narrative. I told them that I knew exactly what the inheritance was worth, and that I wasn't planning on giving up a single penny. If they wanted to regain my trust, which I said just to keep them at bay, they would have to stop trying to manipulate me and start acting like responsible adults. The next morning, the house was silent. There was no elaborate breakfast or attempts at forced conversations. It was as if my ultimatum had left them without the energy to continue pretending. But I knew this wasn't over. By now, it was obvious that they wouldn't give up so easily. The next thing in my plan was to contact my paternal grandparents, those whom my uncles had tried to keep away from me all my life. It was a difficult conversation because they didn't know everything that had happened. But when I told them the truth and sent them pictures of the letters they had written, they couldn't hold back their tears. They told me that they had been trying to communicate with me for years and had even considered taking legal action. But my uncles had convinced them that it wasn't necessary. My grandparents are furious, and rightly so. They promised me they would do everything possible to support me, and that as soon as I turned 18, they would help me put everything in order. They even invited me to stay with them, and I wanted to get away from this house immediately. Although I was comforted to know that I had that option, I decided to stay a little longer. I don't want to leave before making sure my uncles face the consequences of what they did. Since then, I've begun to notice small changes in their behavior. My aunt tries to talk to me from time to time, but now her tone is more fearful than manipulative. My uncle barely looks me in the eye, and my cousins, who probably don't understand the magnitude of what's happening, have stayed out of it. My birthday is just around the corner, and I feel like I'm getting closer and closer to getting the justice I deserve. For now, I continue playing my role, keeping things as normal as possible on the surface. But inside, I'm counting the days. When the time comes, my uncles will have no idea what's coming. Update 4. Yesterday was my birthday, and after years of enduring abuse, lies, and manipulation, I finally took control. It was the day I had been waiting for since I learned about the inheritance, and I made sure that nothing and no one could ruin it. I'm not gonna lie, I was nervous. This wasn't just a step towards my independence. It was the culmination of years of suffering that I couldn't afford to ignore. The day began in an almost surreal way. My uncles, who usually ignored my birthdays or gave me some cheap gift to comply, tried to put together a small party at home. They decorated the dining room with cheap balloons and bought a cake from the supermarket, acting as if they genuinely cared. My aunt even said, "Today we celebrate how grateful we are to have you in our family." Grateful. That word was almost comical coming from them. I forced myself to smile, clap when they cut the cake, and accept their desperate attempts to appear like a united family. I knew they were doing all this because the clock was ticking against them. After all, now that I was 18, the trust officially passed into my control. What they didn't know was that my real birthday present was already underway. I had scheduled a meeting at the lawyer's office that same day. The appointment was set for noon, but I told them I was going out with friends to avoid any suspicion. Before I left, my aunt told me with a forced smile, "Remember that you can always count on us. We're your family." I arrived at the lawyer's office feeling more determined than ever. He already had everything ready, the necessary documents to officially transfer control of the assets to my name and a complete breakdown of what signing those papers would entail. It was an indescribable feeling. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the power in my hands. But it wasn't just about taking control. I also wanted to make sure my uncles faced the consequences. The lawyer explained that although they had spent money that was legally mine, proving that they did so improperly could be complicated. However, the letters, the receipts, and the evidence of mistreatment that I documented over the years were more than enough to support my case. We decided that the best strategy would be to present them with a legal ultimatum: return the money they embezzled or face a formal lawsuit. After the meeting, I felt like a huge burden had been lifted from my shoulders. However, The most intense moment of the day was yet to come, confronting my uncles. I returned home late in the afternoon, as if it were any other day. My aunt was in the kitchen, and my uncle was watching TV. They looked relaxed, probably thinking that their attempts at manipulation were working. I sat on the sofa in front of them and told them we needed to talk. I began directly. Today I turned 18, and I just took control of my parents' inheritance. The silence was absolute. My uncle stared at me, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. My aunt, on the other hand, tried to feign enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, dear. We knew this day would come, and we are so proud of you." I let her talk. I wanted them to think, even for a moment, that everything was fine. Then I took out a copy of the ultimatum that my lawyer had prepared. I put it on the table in front of them and said, "This is what's going to happen from now on." I explained that I had evidence of how they had misused the money intended for my support. I detailed the expenses that were not appropriate and the letters they hid from my grandparents. I also told them that if they didn't return the money within a reasonable time, the lawyer would file a formal lawsuit against them. My aunt immediately started crying, saying that she didn't understand why I was doing this and that everything they did was out of love. My uncle, on the other hand, became furious. He yelled that I was ungrateful, that they had given me everything, and that I had no right to treat them like this after all their sacrifices. I stood firm. I told them they could no longer control or manipulate me. I reminded them that I had legal backing and that if they tried anything, it would only make their situation worse. The most interesting thing was the reaction of my cousins. While my aunt cried and my uncle yelled, they were on the stairs watching everything in silence. I think for the first time they realized that something was terribly wrong with their perfect family. When I finished speaking, I got up and told them that I was considering moving in with my grandparents. I made it clear that I no longer depended on them, and that from now on, things would be very different. I left the house without looking back, feeling a freedom I had never experienced before. That night I stayed at a friend's house, just to have some distance while I decided my next step. My lawyer has already sent them the formal ultimatum, and now I'm waiting for their response. I don't expect them to accept it easily, but I don't care. I'm ready for whatever comes because I finally have control of my life. Final update. It's been a month since my birthday, and I can now say with satisfaction that I've gotten the justice I longed for. I not only managed to take back control of my life, but I also exposed my uncles for the despicable people they are, ruining the exemplary family image they worked so hard to maintain. This last month has been a whirlwind of emotions, but every step I took led me to this moment. They wanted to destroy me, but in the end, I was the one who dismantled their facade. After delivering the legal ultimatum, the chaos began to escalate rapidly. At first, they tried to ignore it, pretending it wasn't a serious matter. My uncle, confident as ever, told me, "You have nothing. If you wanted to sue, you would have done it already." My aunt, on the other hand, tried to appeal to my compassion, begging me to reconsider. "Do you really want your cousins to suffer through all this? It will affect them more than us." But I wasn't going to back down. I let my lawyer proceed with the proceedings. A few days later, they received a formal summons, and that's when everything started to fall apart for them. First, I discovered that my uncle had a darker financial history than I imagined. Apparently, he had used part of the money from my trust to cover personal debts, including late mortgage payments and credit cards. This wasn't only morally repugnant, but also completely illegal. My lawyer made sure this detail was at the center of the lawsuit, and the legal implications left them reeling. As for my aunt, her victim mask quickly fell off when the lawyer presented evidence of how she had hidden the letters from my grandparents. That act, although not as serious as the misuse of the money, showed a clear pattern of emotional manipulation and intentional isolation. In my eyes, it was just as unforgivable. My uncles tried everything to get out of the problem. First, they tried to countersue me, arguing that I was being unfair and that my claim was ungrateful. But their lawyer, who was clearly not as competent as mine, made it clear that they had no grounds to fight. Then they tried to negotiate with me privately, offering me a portion of the money they embezzled if I dropped the case. Of course, I refused any deal. This wasn't just about the money. This was about revenge, about justice, about everything they had done to me. As the case progressed, something unexpected happened. The community began to find out what was happening. My lawyer filed the necessary documents in court, and since it was a matter of inheritance and fraud, some of the information became public. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances of my uncles began to realize that they were not the perfect family they always pretended to be. The final blow came from my paternal grandparents. Since reconnecting with them, they have been my greatest support, and they didn't stand idly by while all this was happening. They decided to travel from their country to attend one of the preliminary hearings. And when they arrived, they did something I'll never forget. They confronted my uncles directly in the courthouse hallway. My grandmother, a small woman but with incredible strength, approached my aunt and said, "You took our grandson away from us for 16 years. Now we are going to make sure you pay for every day you made him suffer." My uncles couldn't respond. My aunt started to cry, and my uncle simply looked away. It was at that moment that I knew they had lost not only the case, but also any power they ever had over me. Finally, the day of the settlement arrived. My uncles, unable to defend themselves in court, agreed to return a significant portion of the money they embezzled, even though that meant selling their house. Yes, they had to sell the house where they had treated me like a servant for years. There was something extremely poetic about seeing them lose the place they valued so much. That same place where they humiliated me and made me feel less than nothing. But that wasn't all. They also agreed to pay additional compensation for the emotional damage they caused, something they didn't expect. Although no amount of money can erase what I experienced, knowing that every penny they give me will be a reminder of their defeat is enough for me. After the settlement, their lives began to crumble even further. The community repudiated them, especially when it became known that they had spent money from my trust on luxuries for themselves. The friends who used to praise their sacrifice stopped talking to them, and their children, my cousins, began to resent them for ruining the family's stability. I heard that they are now living in a small apartment and that my uncle has to work overtime to stay afloat. As for me, I decided to move in with my grandparents. They welcomed me with open arms, and for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm in a home full of love and respect. I'm planning my future, something I could never do while living under my uncle's control. Maybe I'll study, travel, or simply enjoy my new freedom. The best part is that I'm no longer afraid. For years they had the power, but now I know that justice exists and that patience and determination can accomplish a lot. My revenge is complete, and they know that every decision they made to harm me led them to where they are now, on the verge of ruin.